For 80 years, the US dollar was the only language power spoke. It wasn't just money, it was the invisible foundation of everything you know as normal life. That reign is cracking. And the first to notice weren't Americans, it was the countries that held up the system and decided they no longer wanted to be the pillars of a structure that could collapse at any moment. What is really happening to the dollar? And what changes for you when the floor beneath your standard of living starts to give way? In 1944, the United States pulled off the greatest financial masterstroke in history. While the rest of the world was counting its dead, Washington bought the system that would come after. They convinced 44 nations that the dollar would be the only reliable anchor on the planet. And when the promise to convert dollars into gold was torn up in 1971, the dollar didn't fall, it became absolute. The dollar stopped being just a currency and became the mandatory toll of the modern economy. Oil, technology, food, everything that moves the world began requiring American paper to be transacted. That monopoly gave America unprecedented power, the ability to export inflation and import real wealth. The rest of the planet subsidized the American middle-class standard of living, financing a comfort that never received an invoice. But monopolies built on the force of logic only break when the risk of staying becomes greater than the cost of leaving. In February 2022, Washington gave the world the reason it had been missing, and the global calculus changed forever. Ukraine's invasion triggered an unprecedented financial maneuver, the freezing of $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. These were resources held in Western banks under the premise of security that any sovereign savings requires. With one click, that capital ceased to exist for Moscow. The blockage happened without formal confiscation or prior trial, with a speed that paralyzed reserve managers across the entire planet. The pressure on Moscow was immediate and effective. However, the side effect was a silent alarm that echoed in Beijing, New Delhi, Brasilia, and Riyadh. Capitals that had never questioned the system understood the new reality. The dollar had become a weapon capable of hitting anyone, including nuclear powers. In just 2 years, forced out of the system, Russia abandoned the dollar and the euro, shifting the weight of its reserves to gold and the Chinese yuan. It was a move of immediate survival that proved to the world that it is possible to operate outside Washington's orbit. Despite hundreds of billions leaving the system, the dollar maintained its facade of stability. Around 57% of global reserves remain anchored in the American currency, proving the system is capable of absorbing massive shocks and moving forward. The real transformation happened in behavior, something the numbers still don't fully capture. The Russian lesson served as the catalyst for the fastest build-out of alternative financial infrastructure in modern history. The infrastructure of the New World isn't being built in the spotlight. It grows in the shadows of transactions that increasingly bypass the American system. The movement has spread across dozens of capitals simultaneously. Governments that spent decades operating under Washington's rules are quietly paving their own emergency exits. China established CIPS, its international payment system, as the direct competitor to SWIFT. In March 2026, this system broke all-time records, processing an average of $133 billion per day, operating across more than 190 countries. Transactions that once required custody in New York banks now find liquidity in Beijing. The relevance of this system lies in its speed of expansion, not its current volume. Just a few years ago, this infrastructure didn't even exist at operational scale. In June 2026, Brazil issued its first sovereign debt in yuan. That operational decision proves the alternative system has reached the maturity a government needs to trust its financial future to it. At the same time, central banks are stockpiling gold at record pace. The metal functions as the ultimate safeguard against any political freeze. The Federal Reserve itself documented it. Gold's share of global reserves more than doubled in under a decade. Even the architects of the old system are switching sides. Jim O'Neill, the economist who coined the BRICS acronym, abandoned 25 years of skepticism to admit that the dollar alternative has stopped being a fantasy. The topic has become an obsession in Washington, mentioned in presidential statements as an existential threat, with Trump threatening 100% tariffs on any country trying to replace the dollar. When power starts shouting against a competitor, it's because the competitor became real. The silent erosion of American hegemony already has a concrete address: yours. The dollar's death will be a process of continuous erosion, gradual, with no date on the calendar. The awakening to this reality will come through gradually higher prices, restricted credit, and a Washington diminished in its capacity for global influence. The initial impact lies in the cost of goods. Global demand for dollars to purchase oil and technology sustains the currency's value and guarantees cheap imports for the American consumer. The decline of that demand raises the price of everything that crosses borders. That increase happens incrementally, month after month. The subsequent effect hits the heart of the credit system. Currently, the U.S. government enjoys low interest rates because the world uses treasury bonds as a store of value. Foreign investors hold $9 trillion in American debt, the equivalent of 32% of the total. The reduction of that demand forces interest rates up, dragging along mortgages, vehicle loans, and business credit. The cost of American debt, already exceeding $1 trillion annually, becomes a burden passed directly to the citizen. The loss of geopolitical leverage is the factor that alarms Washington most. The effectiveness of American sanctions depends on the indispensability of the dollar. With the consolidation of alternative routes, America's financial coercion power fades. The freezing of Russian reserves served as a show of force but also acted as the greatest catalyst for the adoption of parallel systems. This erosion remains invisible until the structure gives way. When the perception becomes general, the bill will already have arrived. The dollar still controls around 57% of global reserves and 88% of foreign exchange transactions. The Federal Reserve is clear. Absent a systemic crisis, dominance will persist. But what today's statistics don't show is tomorrow's behavior. $300 billion frozen taught the world that the safest vault on the planet can become a weapon. Nobody with something to lose learns that lesson twice. The bill will arrive without warning. In the price at the grocery store, in the mortgage rate, in imports that get a little more expensive every year, in a way that looks like normal inflation until someone does the math and realizes the ground has shifted. If you want to keep understanding how these forces reach your wallet, subscribe. And tell me in the comments, do you think the dollar will hold its global reserve status for the next generation, or are we watching the beginning of the end of an era?